A man is walking through a desert that has a name meaning you go in, you don't come out. His hands are bound. He hasn't seen his home country in 3 years. His entire mission, the most important diplomatic assignment in the history of the Han Dynasty, has collapsed before it even started. He was supposed to forge an alliance. Instead, he's a prisoner. His name is Chang'an. The year is approximately 135 BCE. And what happens to him over the next decade will accidentally create the most consequential trade network in the history of human civilization. Here is what I'm going to show you by the end of this documentary. The Silk Road, this 1,400-year network of routes connecting East Asia to the Mediterranean, is not the story most people tell. It isn't primarily a story about silk. It isn't primarily a story about merchants and camels and exotic spices. It's a story about what happens when the world's most powerful civilizations discover each other, and about the extraordinary, horrifying things they do with that knowledge. By the time we're done, you'll understand why the Silk Road's greatest export wasn't a luxury good. It was an idea. And later, a disease. And the combination of those two things changed the trajectory of every society on Earth. That is the real story. And almost nobody tells it this way. Let me give you a number first. 4,000 miles. That's the approximate east to west span of the Silk Road Central Corridor. But here's what that number doesn't tell you. The Silk Road wasn't a road. It was never called the Silk Road by anyone who actually traveled it. That name was invented by a German geographer named Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877, nearly 4 centuries after the routes had largely died. What it actually was, a shifting, branching, overlapping mesh of paths and corridors, some through scorching desert, some over mountain passes that killed horses in minutes. Some routes went by sea. Some hugged river systems through Central Asia. And almost nobody ever traveled the entire thing. Most of the people who kept it alive never saw more than a few hundred miles of it. They handed goods off like a relay. Silk left China. Changed hands in Dunhuang. Changed hands in Kashgar. Changed hands in Mer. Changed hands in Ctesiphon. Changed hands in Palmyra. Arrived in Rome. The man who wove the silk never met the senator who wore it. They were separated by a dozen transactions, 4 languages, 3 empires, and a world neither could fully imagine. And yet, they were connected. Here's something you need to understand about silk, because it changes everything. For roughly 600 years, China held a monopoly on it. Not because no one wanted to compete. Because the penalty for revealing how silk was made, for exporting silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds, was death. The Romans thought silk grew on trees. They literally thought it was a plant fiber cone from leaves. They were paying staggering amounts of money, at certain points, the equivalent of gold by weight, for a product whose origin they couldn't even describe correctly. And here's where it gets strange. The Chinese emperor wasn't just protecting a luxury good. He was protecting the most potent diplomatic weapon of the ancient world. Silk wasn't just fabric. Silk was power, soft, shimmering, wearable power. The emperors used it to pay soldiers, to bribe enemies, to reward allies, to demonstrate that China existed on a level other civilizations couldn't touch. Which means the Silk Road, at its root, wasn't about commerce. It was about dominance. And it began, not with a merchant, but with a prisoner who refused to give up. Here is the decision made in the Chinese palace that I told you about. It was not about trade. Emperor Wu of Han, one of the most formidable rulers in Chinese history, had a problem. The Xiongnu. These were nomadic confederations on China's northern steppe, and they had been terrorizing Han borders for decades. Cavalry warfare is how you stop them. And cavalry warfare requires horses. The horses Emperor Wu had weren't good enough. They were small, stunted, bred for the flat plains. Then, through trade rumors and the reports of wandering merchants, he heard something extraordinary. Somewhere to the west, in a kingdom called Dayuan, in what we now call Fergana in modern Uzbekistan, there were horses unlike anything in the known world. The Chinese texts called them Tianma, heavenly horses. These animals were described as sweating blood when they ran, likely a parasitic condition causing red sweat, and they were taller, stronger, and faster than anything the Han army possessed. Emperor Wu became obsessed. Not with trade. With those horses. That obsession is why Zhongqian existed. In 138 BCE, Emperor Wu sent Zhongqian west with a delegation of roughly 100 men. The mission: find the Yuezhi people, a displaced Central Asian tribe, and convince them to form a military alliance against the Xiongnu. Zhongqian got about as far as the Gansu corridor before the Xiongnu captured him. He spent 10 years as their prisoner. 10 years. He learned the Xiongnu language. He married a Xiongnu woman. He had children. And he never stopped thinking about his mission. When he finally escaped, making his way west to find the Yuezhi, he discovered they no longer wanted war. They had settled into new lands, built new lives, and had no interest in his emperor's vendetta. The diplomatic mission was a complete failure. But on the way home, captured again by the Xiongnu for another year before escaping again, Zhongqian had gathered something more valuable than any alliance. He had detailed knowledge of the entire Western world. The kingdoms that existed there. The products they made. The routes that connected them. He brought back information so vivid, so specific, so unprecedented that Emperor Wu used it to launch not just a military campaign, but a full-scale Western expansion that opened the trade corridors we now call the Silk Road. The man who failed his mission built the ancient world's most important highway. Now let's settle something, because most documentaries get this wrong. Silk was important. But silk wasn't even close to the most important thing moving on these routes. Here's a partial list of what actually traveled the Silk Road in its prime. Paper, invented in China, unknown in the West until Arab traders encountered it in the 8th century and carried it to Europe. Gunpowder, same story. The printing press's precursor technologies, same story. Cotton from India. Glass from Rome, so rare in China that it was considered as precious as jade. Spices from South Asia and Southeast Asia, pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, commodities so valuable they were used as currency throughout the Mediterranean. Horses, in both directions. Gold, silver, copper, and lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone mined in the mountains of what is now Afghanistan, which traveled so far west that it ended up in Egyptian tomb paintings as the blue pigment on pharaonic artifacts thousands of years before the formal Silk Road even existed. Trade routes are older than civilization. The Silk Road didn't create connection between East and West. It formalized it, accelerated it, and made it permanent in ways the world had never seen. Here's the detail that reframes everything I said in the opening chapter. The Roman historian Pliny the Elder complained, bitterly, in writing, that silk was destroying the Roman economy. He estimated that Rome was spending the equivalent of 100 million sesterces per year importing silk and other Eastern luxuries. He called it a drain of gold to foreign and hostile peoples. Hostile. That's the word he chose. Rome and China never met. No Roman delegation ever reached the Han court. No Chinese diplomat ever walked the streets of Rome. And yet Rome considered China a hostile trading rival, a civilization bleeding Roman gold eastward through 1,000 intermediaries neither empire could control. That's the Silk Road in one sentence. Two superpowers, connected by a web of middlemen, draining each other of resources they couldn't stop needing, each one afraid of the other, neither one having ever seen the other's face. The modern word for that is globalization. and it was already operating at full speed 2,000 years ago. There is a commodity that moved along the Silk Road that I haven't mentioned yet. I told you there was one, more important than silk, more lethal than any army. I want to get there slowly, because the setup matters. For the first several centuries of its operation, the Silk Road was overwhelmingly a force for what we'd call good. Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and then into China along these routes. Zoroastrianism spread west. Islam, after the 7th century, spread east. The four major religious traditions of the ancient world crossed each other on these paths, traded ideas, borrowed iconography, influenced each other's art and theology in ways that scholars are still mapping today. A Buddhist temple in western China might have a Persian-influenced archway. A mosque in Samarkand might use Chinese tile patterns. Ideas, like silk, don't stay in one place. But here's the first turn. The very same properties that made the Silk Road the greatest conduit for human culture, the density of travel, the interconnectedness of far-flung populations, the constant flow of bodies and goods through crowded caravanserais, made it the most efficient disease vector the world had ever constructed. You built the road. You built the highway for everything, including the things you didn't invite. Before we get to the disease, I want to give you one of the most audacious acts of industrial espionage in human history. Around 550 CE, the exact date is disputed, two Nestorian Christian monks walked out of China. They carried nothing suspicious, just the long hollow wooden staffs that pilgrims commonly used. Inside those staffs, silkworm eggs, smuggled out of the country whose death penalty for this exact act had stood for centuries. The monks brought the eggs to Constantinople, to the court of Emperor Justinian I of Byzantium. Justinian had been desperate to break the Persian monopoly on Silk Road transit. Every bolt of Chinese silk that reached Byzantium had passed through Persia, and the Persians extracted fees at every choke point. The monks handed him the keys to end that dependency forever. Within a generation, the Byzantine Empire had its own silk industry. The monopoly that had powered Chinese diplomacy for 600 years evaporated. Not because of military defeat. Not because of a failed negotiation. Because two monks took a walk with the right walking sticks. Here's what I want you to hold on to. The Silk Road's greatest transactions weren't always the ones recorded in trade ledgers. Sometimes the most important things that moved were the things no one was supposed to be carrying. By the 7th and 8th centuries CE, under the Tang Dynasty in China and the early Abbasid Caliphate in the West, the Silk Road reached what many historians consider its first golden age. Let me describe the infrastructure, because it tells you everything about how seriously these empires took this network. A caravanserai, from the Persian caravan palace, was a roadside complex spaced roughly a day's journey apart across Central Asia. Merchants could sleep, stable their animals, store their goods, eat hot food, and find fresh water. Some caravanserais in Persia and the Levant were substantial buildings with vaulted ceilings, private rooms, and locked storage facilities. They were, effectively, the ancient world's combination of hotel, bank, and trading floor. Along the major routes, you might encounter merchants speaking Sogdian, Arabic, Persian, Chinese, Tibetan, Turkish, Greek, and Sanskrit within the same courtyard. The Sogdians, a Central Asian people from what is now Uzbekistan, deserve special mention here. They were the backbone of Silk Road commerce for centuries. Unaffiliated with any major empire, extraordinarily skilled at language and negotiation, they built trading networks from China to the Byzantine Empire. When archaeologists excavated Sogdian merchant letters abandoned near Dunhuang around 313 CE, real letters, written in real ink on real paper, they found evidence of trading networks, family businesses, and market intelligence that looked, structurally, almost like a modern corporation. These were professionals. and none of the empires they served could have functioned without them. Here is the central tension of the entire Silk Road story. Every empire that touched these routes faced the same impossible paradox. The road made you rich. The road also made you vulnerable. To keep the road working, you needed stable borders, safe passage, and cooperative neighbors. But the wealth that flowed through those borders also made every neighboring power want to control, or destroy, what you had built. Every caravanserai was also a strategic target. Every merchant caravan was also an intelligence operation. Every trade deal was also a geopolitical negotiation. The Silk Road was never just commerce. It was always geopolitics in motion. And the powers that understood both dimensions simultaneously, China, Persia, the Abbasid Caliphate, eventually the Mongols, were the ones that briefly made the road work at its absolute maximum. The ones who understood only the military dimension, or only the commercial dimension, tended to do something catastrophic to the network. Which brings us to the most catastrophic event in Silk Road history. And I'm not talking about the plague yet. I'm talking about what happened in 1218 CE, a single diplomatic insult that set off a chain of destruction that would ultimately kill more people than any event since. In 1218 CE, Genghis Khan sent a trade delegation to the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful Islamic sultanate controlling much of Persia and Central Asia. The delegation consisted of roughly 450 Muslim merchants and Mongol envoys, carrying enormous quantities of goods, gold, silk, silver, as a formal diplomatic gesture. The governor of the border city of Otrau, a man named Inalchuk, who also happened to be the uncle of the Shah, ordered every member of the delegation executed. He accused them of being spies. He seized their goods. He sent a report to his nephew the Shah claiming the situation was handled. When news reached Genghis Khan, he sent a second delegation, 3 envoys, demanding justice and the extradition of Inalchuk. The Shah executed the lead envoy. He shaved the heads of the other 2 and sent them back. This is the moment. This is the diplomatic insult that triggered the Mongol conquest of Central Asia. Not a battle. Not a border dispute. Not a territorial ambition. One governor's paranoia, one Shah's arrogance, and the Silk Road's golden age was over. What Genghis Khan did next was not a military campaign. It was an erasure. City after city across Central Asia, cities that had been Silk Road hubs for centuries, were systematically destroyed. Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, Nishapur, and Merv. Merv, in what is now Turkmenistan, had been one of the largest cities on earth. In its prime, it may have housed between 200,000 and 500,000 people. It was a center of Islamic scholarship, astronomy, and medicine. When the Mongols arrived in 1221 CE, the city surrendered. The Mongols promised mercy. Then they separated the population outside the walls. And here is the number I promised you. Contemporary sources, including the Persian historian Jujani, claim that 700,000 people were killed at Merv alone. Some later sources say 1.3 million. Those figures are almost certainly exaggerated. But modern archaeologists excavating the site have confirmed mass graves and catastrophic population collapse on a scale that supports the conclusion, whatever happened at Merv was among the largest single-city massacres in human history. I'll be honest with you, this part is hard to sit with. Because the archaeological record doesn't lie about the scale. The city never recovered. It stayed uninhabited for decades. And Merv was not an exception. It was the template. And here's where I need you to hold 2 things in your mind at once, because this is the most genuinely uncomfortable part of the Silk Road story. The Mongol Empire, the empire that destroyed Merv, leveled Nishapur, and killed millions across Central Asia, also created the safest trade corridor in the history of the ancient world. Under this system, merchants traveling the Silk Road were protected by Mongol law across the entire Eurasian steppe. Caravans could move from China to Persia to the Black Sea coast without being robbed, taxed to oblivion, or murdered at political borders. A standardized system of couriers, the Yam relay system, allowed messages to travel thousands of miles in days. Marco Polo traveled the Silk Road under Mongol protection in 1271 CE. He reached China safely. He was received at the court of Kublai Khan. He spent 17 years there. The destruction made the connection possible. I'm not defending it. I'm telling you that the history of the Silk Road refuses to let you have clean heroes and clean villains. The greatest destroyer was also, functionally, the greatest protector. What do you do with that? Let me bring the scale down to something human for a moment. When archaeologists excavated a collapsed watchtower near Dunhuang in the early 20th century, they found a bundle of Sogdian letters. The letters dated to around 313 CE. One of them was written by a woman named Narnidat. She had been left behind in Dunhuang by her husband, who had traveled further east on a trading expedition. She wrote that she had received no money from him in 3 years. She was surviving by working for another Sogdian family, work she described as difficult. She wrote that she would rather be a dog or a pig in her homeland than continue her situation in China. She begged her mother to send her passage home. The letter was never delivered. It sat in that watchtower for 1600 years. The trading network that her husband was part of, the network that had built a Sogdian commercial empire across thousands of miles, had apparently, in his case, simply left her behind. That letter is now in a museum. Narnidat never made it home. The Silk Road made empires rich. What it made of individual lives is a different story entirely. We've talked about merchants. We've talked about emperors and diplomats and spies. But the Silk Road was also traveled by monks seeking scripture, by artists carrying new techniques, by engineers who had seen something in one city that another city desperately needed, by enslaved people, sold, traded, transported across thousands of miles as human commodities. Let me say that plainly. The Silk Road was one of the ancient world's largest slave trade corridors. Enslaved people from the steppes, from sub-Saharan Africa via Arabian routes, from the fringes of every empire, they traveled these roads under conditions that no caravanserai was built to accommodate. When we celebrate the exchange of ideas and the diffusion of culture along the Silk Road, we are describing a system that was built and maintained partly on human trafficking. That isn't a caveat. It's a central feature. The same route that carried Buddhism into China carried enslaved Turks into the Abbasid Caliphate, where they became, eventually, the military class that overthrew the very caliphate that had purchased them. The road moved everything. And the cost of everything it moved was paid by people who had no choice. In 1325, a 21-year-old man from Tangier in Morocco set out on what he described as a pilgrimage to Mecca. He didn't go home for 29 years. His name was Ibn Battuta. Over the course of his travels, he covered an estimated 75,000 miles, more than any traveler before him, and more than Marco Polo by a factor of 3. He traveled through North Africa, the Middle East, the Horn of Africa, the east coast of Africa, Persia, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, and China. And here is what makes his account uniquely valuable for our purposes. Ibn Battuta traveled the Silk Road, or what remained of it, in the mid-14th century. He was writing during the period when the road was still functioning but already fraying. He described the city of Samarkand as magnificent. He described caravanserais, bustling markets, and cosmopolitan populations across Central Asia. He also described cities that had never recovered from the Mongol invasions a century earlier. Ghost cities, empty caravanserais, trade routes with no travelers, Ibn Battuta was watching the world's greatest network age in real time. And in his final years, he encountered something along the routes of the Black Sea region that he described with the same words everyone would soon be using everywhere. People were dying. Very quickly. And in enormous numbers. This is the commodity I've been waiting to tell you about. The one more important than silk. The one that killed more people than any war in the history of the ancient world. Yersinia pestis. The bacterium that causes bubonic plague. The scientific consensus, supported by ancient DNA analysis from mass graves across Central Asia, is that the plague responsible for the Black Death originated in or near the Tian Shan Mountains, in what is now Kyrgyzstan. There are 14th century gravestones in that region, found by archaeologists, with inscriptions in Syriac that specifically mention pestilence as the cause of death, dated to 1338 and 1339. 2 years before the plague reached Europe. The disease moved exactly as everything on the Silk Road moved. West. Along the trading routes. Through caravanserais. Through merchant camps. Through the bodies of rats living in grain stores, fleas transferring between animal and human hosts at every stop. In 1346, a Mongol army besieging the Genos trading outpost at Kaffa, on the Crimean coast, was devastated by plague within their own ranks. According to the chronicler Gabriel de Omussis, the Mongol commanders ordered the bodies of the dead catapulted over the city walls. Whether or not that account is literally accurate, what is not disputed is this: the Genos merchants fleeing Kaffa carried the plague back to Sicily, Genoa, and Venice. The road had delivered its most consequential cargo. Between 1347 and 1353, the Black Death killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population. The lower estimate, 25 million dead. The higher estimate, 50 million. In 6 years. To put that in a context your brain can actually process, that's the equivalent of the entire current population of Spain and France combined, gone, within the span of one American presidential term. Some regions of Europe lost more than half their population. In Florence, one of the most vibrant cities in the Western world, the chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio described bodies piling in the streets faster than the living could bury them. He described animals eating the dead. He described families abandoning sick members in their homes and fleeing. The psychological trauma of those years, the flagellant movements, the pogroms against Jewish communities wrongly accused of poisoning wells, the complete collapse of faith in both the church and medicine, all of it flows from one bacterial hitchhiker on a trade route. The Silk Road connected the world. And the world was not ready for what that connection meant. Here's something I want to be honest about. The Silk Road has become romantically mythologized in ways that serve a very specific modern agenda. When you see Silk Road branding on everything from tea packaging to hotel chains to university research institutes, what you're seeing is a deliberate aesthetic, exotic, cosmopolitan, ancient, and wise. That aesthetic strips out the slave trade. It strips out the plague. It strips out the violence of the caravanserai system, where merchants were robbed, kidnapped, and killed with regularity in the regions between stable imperial control. It strips out the fact that the tolerance of the Silk Road was largely economic tolerance. You traded with whoever had things you wanted, regardless of religion, precisely because money outshrank theology. That isn't cosmopolitanism in any modern progressive sense. It's pragmatism. And here's the uncomfortable question: when we mythologize the Silk Road as a model of ancient multiculturalism, whose purposes does that serve? The answer might surprise you. In 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced an initiative he called the Belt and Road Initiative, explicitly invoking the ancient Silk Road as its historical precedent and moral justification. The scale is staggering. As of recent estimates, China has committed to or already invested in infrastructure projects in over 140 countries: roads, ports, railways, pipelines, and digital networks, totaling trillions of dollars in planned investment. Xi Jinping has used the language of ancient connectivity, cultural exchange, and mutual benefit, the romantic Silk Road narrative, to frame what critics describe as a debt-trap diplomacy strategy. Countries accept Chinese financing for infrastructure. When they can't repay, China gains leverage, sometimes operational control, over strategically vital assets. Sri Lanka leased the Hambantota port to China for 99 years after defaulting on Chinese loans. This is not universally agreed upon. Chinese officials and some economists argue that the initiative genuinely develops poorer nations. But the parallel to the ancient Silk Road is instructive precisely because the ancient Silk Road was also never just about trade. It was always about power. It was always about who controlled the routes. The history of the Silk Road isn't being used as a lesson. It's being used as a costume. Here is a perspective the standard Silk Road narrative almost never gives you. The people who actually made the road work, the Sogdian merchants, the Parthian intermediaries, the Arab traders of the Indian Ocean routes, were not empire builders. They were not conquerors. They were professional connectors. And every major empire on the Silk Road, at various points, tried to eliminate or marginalize them. Rome tried to cut out Persian intermediaries and establish a direct sea route to India. China repeatedly attempted to extend state control over the western routes to reduce dependence on Central Asian traders. The Abbasid Caliphate taxed Sogdian merchants punitively at times. The great empires wanted the benefits of the network without the autonomy of the people who ran it. And every time they succeeded in crushing the middlemen, the trade declined. Because the middlemen weren't just moving goods. They were maintaining relationships, managing trust, navigating cultural differences, extending credit across languages and legal systems. They were the human infrastructure. Destroy the human infrastructure and the physical routes mean nothing. There is a lesson here about every supply chain, every international system, every modern trade network. The people the powerful find most expendable are often the ones without whom the whole system fails. One more uncomfortable truth before we move on. For much of the period we're discussing, the most important version of the Silk Road wasn't on land. It was at sea. The maritime routes of the Indian Ocean, connecting East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, India, Southeast Asia, and southern China, were carrying comparable or greater volumes of trade than the overland routes for much of the first millennium CE. Arab, Indian, and Southeast Asian sailors had mastered monsoon navigation centuries before any European mariner approached the open ocean. The dhow networks of the Arabian Sea were moving spices, textiles, gold, and, again, enslaved people in quantities the land routes couldn't match. The overland Silk Road gets the name, the mythology, and the documentary treatment. The maritime routes get almost none of the same attention in Western popular history. Partly this is because sea routes leave fewer ruins. Partly it's because the key players, Arab, Indian, and East African traders, have been systematically written out of the European-centered historical narrative. The real Silk Road was always a land and sea system. The land part is the part we remember. That tells you more about who writes history than it tells you about the history itself. By the mid-14th century, everything the Silk Road depended on was breaking simultaneously. The plague had devastated the population density that commercial routes require: fewer people to buy, fewer people to sell, fewer people willing to travel. The Mongol Empire, which had provided the overland network's political stability for a century, had fragmented into competing successor khanates, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, the Golden Horde, each fighting the others. The route through the Golden Horde's territory was severed by internal warfare. The route through Persia was repeatedly disrupted. And then, in the 1370s and 1380s, a new conqueror emerged from the ruins of the Chagatai Khanate. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane. He rebuilt an empire across Central Asia and Persia. He was also a catastrophe for the Silk Road's Western infrastructure. He deliberately destroyed Sarai, the capital of the Golden Horde, to redirect trade through his own territory and cities. He eliminated competing trade routes. He prioritized Samarkand, his personal capital, as the central node of Central Asian commerce. The road didn't just lose population. It lost geography. Its routes were being deliberately rerouted, cut, and starved of travelers by the very powers that stood to benefit most from controlling what remained. There's a moment in the Silk Road story that has always haunted me. Around 1000 CE, scholars debate the exact date and reason. Someone sealed a cave at Dunhuang in western China. Inside that cave, they placed approximately 40,000 manuscripts, paintings, and artifacts. Buddhist texts, Taoist texts, Confucian texts, Nestorian Christian documents. A single almost complete copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War in a version different from any other known manuscript. Mathematical treatises, astronomical charts, letters, music notations, legal contracts. Someone gathered the intellectual and commercial record of the Silk Road corridor in multiple languages, from multiple cultures, and hid it in a cave. Then sealed the entrance. And it sat there for 900 years. Why was it sealed? Nobody knows for certain. The leading theory is that it was hidden from a military threat, possibly the Western Xia Kingdom, which was pushing east in the early 11th century. Another theory suggests it was a kind of sacred archive, old manuscripts too holy to destroy, interred as a library burial. What we know is this: whoever sealed that cave never came back. The culture they were trying to preserve, the cosmopolitan, multilingual, multi-faith world of the Dunhuang Silk Road corridor, was already contracting. The cave was sealed as the world that filled it was dying. In 1368, the Ming dynasty overthrew the Mongol Yuan dynasty and took control of China. The Ming emperors made a choice. A deliberate, historically consequential choice. They turned China inward. Between 1368 and the late 15th century, the Ming government progressively restricted Chinese merchants from engaging in private overseas and overland trade. The Haijin, maritime prohibition, intermittently banned private Chinese sea trade. The western land routes, never formally closed, became starved of Chinese participation and state support. The Yongle Emperor, the same emperor who sent the extraordinary naval commander Shenghe on 7 massive maritime expeditions between 1405 and 1433, ultimately shuttered those expeditions entirely after Yongle's death. China had briefly projected itself into the Indian Ocean world on a scale that dwarfed any European maritime venture of the period. Zhenghe's treasure ships were, by some estimates, 5 times the length of Columbus's Santa Maria. And then China stopped. Zhenghe's records were deliberately destroyed. The shipbuilding programs were cancelled. The maritime knowledge was suppressed. While China turned its back on the world, a small collection of kingdoms on the Atlantic coast of Europe were quietly developing something new. Something that would change every calculation. Here's where the crisis becomes irreversible. In 1488, Bartholomew Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope. In 1498, Vasco da Gama reached the coast of India. For the first time in history, a European vessel could sail directly, without Arab, Persian, or Indian intermediaries, to the source of the spices that had financed the Silk Road for a millennium. The price of pepper in Lisbon immediately began to fall. Not because there was more pepper. Because the profit margins of every middleman on the overland route had been bypassed in a single voyage. The Silk Road didn't collapse. It didn't end in a battle or a decree. It was rendered economically obsolete. By a Portuguese ship? Traveling in the opposite direction. And that is the most important thing I'm going to tell you in this entire documentary. Don't go anywhere. Here's what most people get wrong about how the Silk Road ended. They imagine it as a collapse, dramatic, sudden, final. A battle. An edict. A wall going up. The reality is stranger and in some ways more disturbing. The Silk Road didn't collapse. It drained. Like water draining from a tub with a slow leak. From 1498 onward, the Cape route progressively shifted luxury trade away from the overland network. Pepper that had traveled from Kerala to Calicut to Hormuz to Baghdad to Aleppo to Venice, a route touching a dozen cultures, supporting hundreds of middlemen and thousands of caravanserais, now traveled from Kerala directly to Lisbon. One route. 2 stops. Enormously cheaper. The caravanserais of Central Asia didn't receive a notice. There was no announcement. The caravans just became less frequent. Then less frequent again. Then seasonal. Then occasional. Then gone. The people who built their lives around the trade, the caravanserai keepers, the money changers, the translators, the cameleers, the merchants, watched their livelihoods evaporate over the course of 2 or 3 generations. Not one of them could have named the reason. Most of them probably blamed bad luck, or the wrong dynasty, or God. The real reason was a ship that sailed south instead of east. I want to stop here and tell you what the Silk Road actually was. Not what we call it. Not what Xi Jinping calls it. Not what the tea packaging says. What it actually was. For 14 centuries, it was the closest thing the pre-modern world ever produced to a single global system. It wasn't governed by anyone. It had no headquarters, no charter, no supreme authority. It operated through distributed networks of trust, merchants who had never met relying on letters of credit, shared commercial law, and the long-term logic that cheating your trading partners eventually ends your business. It spread religion, disease, technology, art, language, and ecological change, rats, fleas, new crop varieties, invasive species, across distances that most of the people living along it could not have conceptualized. It built cities from the ground up, Samarkand, Dunhuang, Palmyra, Bukhara, cities whose entire reason for existing was their position on the route. And it could be destroyed not by armies, but by geometry. When the geometry of global trade changed, when a Portuguese navigator found a cheaper angle, everything built on the old geometry became economically vestigial. The most powerful trade network in human history was beaten not by conquest. It was beaten by a better route. In 1900, a Taoist monk named Wang Yuanlu discovered the sealed cave at Dunhuang while doing maintenance on the cliff temple complex. He broke through a sealed wall and found the 40,000 manuscript library that had been hidden there for 9 centuries. In 1907, a British-Hungarian archaeologist named Aurel Stein arrived. He negotiated, for a sum historians describe as embarrassingly small, on the order of 130 silver horseshoes, access to the manuscripts. He took approximately 7,000 documents and 6 silk paintings back to London. They are now in the British Museum and the British Library. A French scholar named Paul Pelliot came next and took another 5,000 manuscripts to Paris. Russian, Japanese, and American expeditions followed. Wang Yuanlu used some of the proceeds to restore sections of the cave temples. He is still blamed, in some Chinese historical accounts, for selling China's cultural heritage. Stein and Pelliot are still celebrated, in some Western accounts, as visionary archaeologists. The same event. The same documents. Completely opposite moral assessments depending on which side of the transaction you stand on. The Silk Road's legacy, even its physical artifacts, remain contested. The cave that preserved a civilization's memory is now split across a dozen institutions on 4 continents. Just like the civilization that created it. I keep coming back to that sealed cave, to whoever sealed it. They lived in a world that was contracting. The cosmopolitan corridor they inhabited, the world where Arabic and Chinese and Sogdian and Sanskrit coexisted in the same marketplace, the same street, the same document, was shrinking. They gathered what they could. They put it in a cave. They sealed the entrance. And then the world they had tried to preserve moved on without them. I think about what it feels like to watch a connected world become a disconnected one. To watch roots close. To watch languages that used to be understood become foreign. To watch the familiar faces, the traders from 3 cultures who came through every spring, stop coming. We don't know who sealed that cave. We don't know their name. But I think we know something about how they felt. Because that feeling, watching connection dissolve into walls, isn't ancient. It's contemporary. And that is what we need to talk about next. Here is the most disorienting consequence of the Silk Road's greatest catastrophe. The Black Death, which the Silk Road delivered to Europe with devastating efficiency, may have inadvertently accelerated the Renaissance. This isn't a fringe theory. The demographic collapse of 1347 to 1353 killed enormous numbers of serfs, agricultural workers, and urban labourers. The survivors found themselves in a world with dramatically reduced labor supply. Wages rose. Social mobility, previously almost impossible in the rigidly hierarchical feudal system, suddenly became conceivable. The Church, which had promised divine protection and delivered only mass death, lost much of its moral authority. The intellectual space that opened in the aftermath was occupied by a new generation of thinkers who were willing to question received wisdom. By the time Gutenberg developed movable type printing in Europe in the 1440s, itself an adaptation of Chinese printing technology that had traveled westward along the Silk Road, the conditions for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually the scientific revolution were already in place. The plague that the Silk Road carried killed 50 million people, and may have broken open the cultural cage that had constrained European intellectual life for centuries. History rarely deals in clean moral accounts. Not every consequence was accidentally generative. The cities that the Mongols destroyed along the Western Silk Road corridor never recovered their pre-conquest scale or influence. Merv, once a candidate for the title of largest city on Earth, is today a modest archaeological site near the small Turkmen town of Mary. Its population in the 12th century may have been 500,000. The population of Mary today is roughly 120,000. 900 years later, Nishapur in eastern Iran, a major Silk Road hub and one of the great intellectual centers of medieval Islam, was rebuilt after the Mongol destruction but never regained its former significance. Urgench, on the Amu-Darya River, was destroyed so thoroughly that the river was reportedly diverted to flood the ruins. The Mongol conquests didn't just kill people. They deleted the accumulated institutional knowledge of cities that had spent centuries developing expertise in trade, scholarship, irrigation, and governance. Knowledge doesn't come back automatically when the killing stops. It has to be rebuilt, slowly, generation by generation. Some of it was never rebuilt. The counterfactual haunts historians. What did we lose in the libraries of Nishapur that no one ever recovered? Here's what the Silk Road left that can't be measured in trade volumes. Arabic numerals, the number system you use every day, traveled west from India through Arab scholars to Europe partly through the intellectual exchange facilitated by Silk Road connectivity. Before that, Europeans were doing complex mathematics with Roman numerals. Try dividing MCCLXVI by XLI. The word cotton comes from the Arabic kutum. Lemon comes from the Persian limu. Chess from the Sanskrit shaturanga, which traveled through Persia as chatrang, became shatranj in Arabic, and arrived in medieval Europe as the game we know. The game you might have learned as a child was handed to you by 1400 years of cultural relay. Pasta, likely an independent invention in both China and Italy, but possibly influenced by wheat noodle traditions encountered through the Arab trade network. The very idea of paper money, banknotes, developed in Tang Dynasty China partly to manage the weight and danger of carrying large amounts of metal coinage on Silk Road journeys. The Silk Road didn't just move commodities. It moved cognitive infrastructure. The tools you use to think, count, play, and eat are partially the product of a network that has been dead for 5 centuries. You are, right now, living in its aftermath. The roots changed. The logic didn't. Every globalized trade system in the modern world operates on principles that the Silk Road established and stress-tested over 14 centuries. Distributed networks beat centralized monopolies in the long run. The people who maintain the connections, not the people who own the goods, are the most irreplaceable nodes in the system. Disruption to a network doesn't travel linearly, it cascades, often reaching places the original disruption never touched. And the most dangerous things a network can carry are the ones nobody thought to inspect. The COVID-19 pandemic traveled the modern equivalent of the Silk Road, the global aviation network, reaching every continent on Earth within weeks. The same logic. The same catastrophic geometry. The caravanserai has a new name. It's called an airport. And the commodity we failed to inspect was moving in bodies. Just as it did in 1346. 700 years apart. The same mistake. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. There's a recurring image in the Silk Road story that I haven't named directly. Walls. The Great Wall of China, its earliest iterations, was built specifically to contain the nomadic threat that the Silk Road was simultaneously designed to bypass. China built a wall to keep the steppe out, then built a road to reach through the steppe. The wall and the road were built by the same dynasty, often funded by the same treasury. Representing the same political logic, we need to be protected from the world and connected to it simultaneously. You cannot fully have both. The wall says, stay out. The road says, come in. Every civilization that touched the Silk Road was making that same incoherent bargain. Persia taxed the roots it didn't want to share. Rome complained about the gold draining east while buying more silk every year. The Abbasid Caliphate preached the equality of believers while operating slave markets in its major Silk Road cities. The Mongols destroyed the network's population and then expected the network to function. The Ming built the greatest naval fleet in history and then burned the records and locked the ports. There is no version of the Silk Road story where a civilization figured out how to be genuinely open. There are only varying degrees of strategic openness, practiced when convenient, revoked when frightening. The Silk Road lasted roughly 14 centuries. That's longer than Christianity has been the dominant religion of Europe. Longer than the entire recorded history of the Roman Empire from founding to fall. And in all that time, across all those empires, all those dynasties, all those caliphates and kingdoms, no one figured out a governance structure for the network. It was never formally negotiated, never codified, never protected by an institution with actual enforcement power. The closest thing to Silk Road governance was always just the most powerful empire of the moment imposing its own stability and collecting the tolls. When that empire weakened, the network weakened. When that empire fell, the network frayed. The entire system depended on sequential imperial luck. Compare that to the institutions built after World War II, the IMF, the World Bank, the GATT that became the WTO, the UN, imperfect, frustrating, bureaucratic institutions explicitly designed to sustain global trade even when individual powers competed or failed. They were built precisely because the world had finally looked at what happens when global connectivity has no institutional framework. It spreads plague. It collapses with the first great empire that tries to control it alone. The lesson of the Silk Road is written in the founding charters of every multilateral institution we still argue about today. Whether those institutions have actually learned it is a different question. Let me close with something about the name. Silk Road. Seidenstrasse. Coined by Ferdinand von Richthofen in 1877. Richthofen was a German geographer who traveled extensively in China during the height of European imperial expansion in Asia. He was also, functionally, a scout for German commercial interests. His surveys were used to identify regions of China that German businesses might exploit. The romantic name he gave to the ancient trade routes, a name that evokes mystery, exoticism, the perfume of faraway civilizations, was coined in the service of a very 19th-century European project, mapping the world for extraction. The Silk Road was named by a man in service of the same imperial logic that had always governed trade routes. Whoever names the road, controls the road's meaning. Whoever controls the road's meaning, controls the story of who built it, who benefited, and who paid. The Sogdian merchants who kept the route alive for 5 centuries don't have a founding myth. The enslaved people who traveled it in chains don't have a chapter in most textbooks. The women like Nunidat who were left behind while the route moved on, they don't have a monument. The name Silk Road tells you almost nothing about what it was. It tells you a great deal about who got to name it. Zhongqian walked out of that desert eventually. He made it home. He gave Emperor Wu the maps, the intelligence, the knowledge of what lay to the west. And the emperor used it to build something that lasted 14 centuries, connected every civilization on earth, carried plague and philosophy in the same bag, built cities and burned them, made middlemen wealthy and kings desperate, and ended, not with a battle cry or an edict, but with a Portuguese ship rounding a continent going the other way. That is a complete story. Except for one thing. The impulse that created the Silk Road, the need to reach beyond your borders, to find what you can't produce alone, to discover that the world is larger and stranger and more interesting than your walls allow you to see. That impulse didn't die when the roots dried up. It's in every undersea fiber optic cable. Every container ship. Every API call. Every time someone in Cairo reads something written in Seoul, or someone in Sao Paulo watches something made in Lagos. The road is everywhere now. It has no camels. No caravanserais. No silkworm eggs hidden in hollow staffs. But the logic is identical. And so is the danger. So here is the only question that matters, the one I'll leave with you. If we have now built a Silk Road that truly connects every person on Earth, faster, cheaper, and more completely than Zhongqian could have dreamed, what are we hiding in our hollow staffs? And who, exactly, is going to end up paying for it?